And for everything outside of the background image that's visible in HDR Light Studio, that'll be utilized to render the front of the can and create all the reflections there. So also you get, like I've been saying, you get little areas underneath the can where once again HDR Light Studio can't reach, because if I were to add a light underneath, you wouldn't be able to see it because the ground plane is blocking that. So getting back to my point, these background images have a texture applied in the opacity slot to fade the edges off, and then in the actual emission itself, I'm using a texture emission, and in the RGB slot, I've created a custom HDR in Photoshop. So if I just create a brand new image, I'm going to make it 500 pixels by 500 pixels, and in the color mode, I'm going to make it 32-bit. This is where you kind of don't realize sometimes the power of Photoshop, but you're fully capable of creating your own HDRs. So I'm going to go in the color picker and just go to a blue color and kind of go slightly down on the value, and I'm just going to paint some of that color in. Then I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to flip the value here and make the intensity a bit brighter. So now I'm going above those 1 to 255 colors, and actually you'll see as I paint this in, it looks quite weird because it's so intense now that in order for this to smooth out correctly, I need to blur it. So I'm just creating a couple of small variations in how I draw this out, and then I'm just going to use the blur tool. I'm just going to shrink this and stretch it vertically, and then blur it again. And now you can see that because it's a 32-bit file, I can slide down on the exposure control here, and we still have all the tonality in the actual texture itself. So I'm just going to drop this down, set it to linear dodge, just so it's adding over the top, and I might go in and apply some color to that. You can just play with the settings. I'm going to create a new layer. Just blur this. And then I'm going to do it once more and blur it slightly smaller this time. And then over the top of that, I can put a hue and saturation. And you can see just very quickly, you just create a kind of glowing light source that isn't completely uniform, which is what I've done here. So when it comes to positioning these, the beauty of having things real time is if I go to the render settings here, I'm going to reduce the resolution of the render. Right now it's set to 2000 wide. I'm just going to make this 600 pixels. So now at 100%, it's much smaller, but it's going to update much faster. So I've gone in, made these two objects movable proxies. Now I can move them just as if they were lights. And the whole point of positioning these is that they're right on the edge of the geometry to really create that silhouette of the can itself. And because I've gone in and utilized this kind of fading texture here with the fall off, it creates a really nice blurry halo effect, which means that down at the bottom of the can, that light is fading off. It's not going all the way to the base. Now, if I remove this ground plane and reposition the lights, you can see I can get it to actually light underneath the can. And that's something I'm going to play with at the end of this scene when I go in and utilize these bonus passes, because like I was saying in the first lesson, you're not always going to get the final result in a single raw beauty render. In fact, it's pretty much expected not to. So in the print industry, I'm always looking out for little things I can do like this to enhance the way things look. And even if I can't really find much of a use for it. If you're just thinking outside the box like this, when you hand off these extra passes to the retouchers, they're more than happy to go in and try and play with those things and utilize them in ways that you might not understand, but for them, they're so used to getting lots of different passes from photographers, they might find different ways to blend things in. But for now, you can see I've just moved things into a position where the top of the edge of the can is getting hit. I don't have it so high that we're losing all the shape, and I don't have the light so long that the whole can is getting reflected. I've just got them just high enough to fade down right to the base, creating a real nice aesthetic silhouette of the can itself. So that's the first thing I'll set up in the scene, because I want to make sure that the edge is being brought off the background itself. So if I just unhide the background here, you can see I've got a couple of lights in the scene that I wasn't actually utilizing, but I was just experimenting with. Now the next thing to set up is the front reflections. And this is where it gets really tricky, and even though this project's really simple and I'm just trying to ramp you guys up to some of the more complex tasks, sometimes having such a simple project to work on can be your undoing, because there's so many different ways to light it. How do you choose one specific direction to go down? So that leads me to my next point. When you start a job, you need to understand if you're going to try and make the project photorealistic or hyper-realistic, because it's going to dictate the way you light the scene and how you light the scene with what type of HDRs. So for this particular scene, when I started, I wanted to go with a hyper-real look. And if I go back into Photoshop and show you those work in progresses, just bringing those up now, you can see here, going with a hyper-real look where all the reflections are nice and perfect and the can looks kind of candy, ends up actually taking away from the project because there's zero realism in it and it just looks really fake. Whereas early on in the scene, you've got something where I'm trying to make it more photorealistic, but then it looks overlit. So for me, the tricky thing in this project was to kind of balance two different types of lighting. And the way I overcame that is by blending half HDR Light Studio lights, like you can see here, and then half utilizing a background HDR to ping off some reflections that are a little bit more photorealistic, and almost as if on the, if you consider this scene a studio shot, this is the background of the studio that's kind of just really softly affecting the can itself. So I played around with a couple of different HDRs, and I'll just show you how changing some different HDRs can affect the look of the can. So the first HDR I'm going to show you is the Tokyo Big Sight HDR that I utilized in the Mastering V-Ray finale. So if I load that up and then we go and take a look at the can on the right here, you can see how just adjusting it can alter the way the can is rounded. But ultimately what I was going for is just trying to get a few different streaks in the render, because all these soft reflections I can do quite easily in HDR Light Studio, just simply by using, big fall off lights like this. So that's not the tricky part. The tricky part is to get an HDR that has enough little detail in it to bring out some of the realism in the can itself. So this was the first HDR I experimented with, and I also experimented with swapping it from using the source image colors or just a grayscale version of the light. Now, it's important to realize when you're working with a product shot, and specifically something that has a company's logo on it, you don't want to detract from their kind of trademark colors. So if I show you an example of what I mean by that, if I swap to using the HDR's original colors, even though the can creates some nice shapes, the logo itself is being affected by that with the blue lighting. So if I go up on the brightness here, you can just see it starts to fix that. But once again, we've just tinted the can an off blue color, whereas swapping it to a grey version. Simply fixes that, keeps the can looking vibrant, all the same color, and ultimately helps kind of portray the brand itself. You can see once again this HDR I'm using here, it's just not really working, and this is where you're just going to have to go in and experiment with a few different tests, like test HDRs, play around, see what you can achieve. You've always got the option of using the SIBL library that I'll link to in the notes in this course, but I'm sure by this stage you guys have got a pretty solid library of HDRs to work from. And actually, as this is cleaning up, once again you can see some of those streaks coming through, but it's just a little bit too flat on the can. So I'll try one more. And this is actually producing a pretty cool result. So when you find an HDR that's slightly different from your end result, remember you can always render off a second pass for the retouches to potentially play with. So when I see something like this that's producing a little bit more of an interesting result, I'll kind of store it in my memory, and if I need to go back to using something like this later in the project and the retouch is not really happy with the final result I've put out, I can always just swap and give him a new render. Because Octane's so fast, you only need to wait on this specific render box 20 or 30 minutes to have a final render out. And now also, even though we've got a really small resolution here rendering this can, you can see the metallic chrome at the top of the Coke can is actually pinging off some interesting lights with this. So once again, I'll just kind of store this in memory, and if we need to go back doing the final touch-ups, I'll just load this in and do a quick region render of up the top. Okay, so we've got the subtle HDR back in here now, and now I'm just going to run you through the different types of lights I've loaded up onto the can itself to assist in layering over the top of the HDR we've got here. So about halfway through creating the lesson, Tim Harding sent me some reference of some cylindrical product visualization shots, and a couple of them I really liked because it relies on a much more simple lighting setup. So if I bring up Photoshop here, you can see one of the references he sent me relies on using a couple of simple softboxes. You know, you've got one for each edge and you've got two behind the camera, and then they're being cut off by an object in the studio itself. So photographers will either use, most of the time I found it's just a kind of black piece of sanded wood so that it's totally nullifying all the reflections in that area. And you've got a couple of different options when working in HDR Light Studio to achieve that effect. So the best thing about HDR Light Studio is you've got ways of doing it realistically, and then you've got ways of cheating it using the finer controls in the lights themselves. So the first thing I'm going to show you how to set up is how to do it as if the photographer was lighting it like that. So I'm going to create a round softbox. I'm just going to get this into position on the left hand side of the Coke, just roughly. I might play with the fall off a little bit. Then I'm going to place another softbox on the opposite side of the Coke can. And this is just placeholders for now. But you can see what's happening is if we go back to the reference, on the left softbox here, the cutoff is slightly off center, and therefore it's kind of fading in on the inside, whereas the right side's got this perfectly clean cutoff, and that really helps to sell the fact that it's a glass object. It's not a smooth, glossy, it's not a smooth, blurry surface, and it helps to bring out the shape in the object. So to achieve that effect, inside HDR Light Studio, you've got the option, and I'm just going to duplicate this light. I'm going to drag the fall off all the way up so that we're creating a fully solid object, and then you've got the option of setting it to be inverted, and that's going to take away the light from the other lights in the scene. So now I can move this to the center, and you can see the effect we're getting here will be very similar to what's happening in the photo. But the difference is between this project and the Guinness project is that glass has only got one level of reflectivity, whereas the Coke can itself has the base metallic layer, which you can see is kind of blurring off the center, and then it's got the top coat. But essentially we're getting the same effect here. You can see on the left the softbox is kind of fading in, and then on the right we're getting this hard line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the intensity of the lights underneath to demonstrate that effect, and then I'm actually going to drop the fall off down so that we're creating more of a gradient from left to right. So to do that, I'm going to go into the custom gradient option. I'm going to set it to Bezier, and I'm going to drag this down. Sometimes I think you're going to need to utilize more than 1 point or so if you really want to get that fading off. Now you can see that's adjusted the light quite heavily, and it's not actually on the center line of where that cutoff was taking place. So if I drag this out and make it a bit wider, and I make the light a bit higher, as I bring that closer to the black box cutting this reflection off, you can see we're getting that effect of the highlight kind of hitting a perfectly cut off line. But it's quite a bit of work to achieve that result, and there's no other way of doing it in real life, but in HDR Light Studio you do have a couple of different options. So just before I move on from there, I'll just kind of balance this out just to show you what it looks like and the type of control you've got. So I'm just going to once again set this to be fully faded off. I'm going to make this light a little bit wider, and then I'm going to go in and make this a custom fall off as well. But in my eyes, it's not the best way of doing it. So now I'm going to show you how I'd actually do it utilizing the finer controls in the lights themselves. So I'm just going to delete these top lights. I'm going to go in and I'm going to create a spherical light. I'm going to start by setting the height to where I need it, and I'm going to get this into position here. Now one of the coolest options you've got in HDR Light Studio is setting the light to be half. But when you do that, you're going to have to rotate the light to be orientated in a way where it's vertical on the cutoff. So to get that, I'm going to go to an angle of 270, and now I can start adjusting the height. And you can see if I zoom out here, using this option creates a much more clean reflection over the light itself. And now I can start to play with the fall off and the opacity, knowing that it's already creating that perfect hard edge on the light itself, while not blocking off the light we've got behind the camera from the HDR. And I can start to play with the width of the light. But because we've rotated it, just remember the width and the height gets reversed. So the width now becomes the height. Now the easiest way to repeat this effect on the other side is to duplicate the light, and then I can just slide things along the longitude, and rotate the light the opposite way. And to get that, I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. And now I can just play with the longitude, and I'm going to move it into a position where the highlight is sitting between the C gap and the O gap. Like so. So both these lights probably aren't intense enough, so I'm just going to increase the brightness of those. Just copy the settings. And every time I make a intensity adjustment like that, I just wait for the render to clear up a little bit. Even though it's such a small resolution, it's important to realize that, like I was saying earlier in the course, in the lesson, you've got to balance out the logo brightness so that you're not going over 1 on those areas. So now one of the things that's lacking here is that near the top of the can, we're losing that kind of nice gradation because the light isn't long enough and it's actually fading up near the top. So one of the things you can do to fix this is, and I'll just show you one light at a time. Turn off the background. You can go into the light and you can set the bulb length. Now you can see as I'm doing that, it's spreading the light vertically, and now we're actually getting that nice highlight starting to appear at the top of the can as well. So just an example, I'll go back to 0 and I'll go all the way up to 100, and now you can see that effect spreading through, and it really helps, especially with the top of the can. And just copy the setting to the other light, and you can see a little preview of how that is spreading up there. Okay, so now that I've done the 2 edge lights, I need a little bit more shape in the center of the can to really bring it out. So to do that, I'm just going to create a simple light down the center. I'm going to set the fall off as usual to 0. I'm going to go in and create a custom Bezier and drag this down, just increasing the brightness until I can see the light a bit more. And then I'm just going to adjust the brightness. One of the things distracting me in this render right now, though, is I haven't turned off these back reflectors. So to do that, I'm just going to go in, select them in max, go to object properties, not Octane properties, and turn off visible to camera. And now we've got a much cleaner view, but you can see it's still reflecting in the floor. So one of the unfortunate things about Octane is it doesn't have an excluder like V-Ray. So I could exclude these lights or this object from, well, actually in V-Ray I'd be using V-Ray lights because they have texture sources. I'd actually exclude those from hitting the ground plane, and I wouldn't have to post work that out. But because it's a very simple thing, I can basically just hand paint that out. So I'm just going to let this clean up for a little bit. I might actually increase the resolution at this point once you're at an area where you're fairly happy. and just start to see how things look. Another great thing about Octane is you've got the option to do region rendering now. So I can turn that on, and for the top of the can where there's the streaks, I can just let that clear and see how that's actually looking. Now, just before I finish off the lighting here, I'm going to show you, after I finish the lighting here, I'm going to show you how to set up anisotropic highlights in Octane, because I'm not sure if you noticed in the material editor settings here, if I go and create a glossy material, there is no anisotropy. And the reason for that is because Octane relies purely on bump mapping to create that effect. And this is probably the single strongest highlight of using Octane. The bump mapping is just ridiculous. Like, it's absolutely insane the type of stuff and effects you can achieve purely with bump mapping. It's better than Modo's, it's better than Maxwell's, it's better than V-Ray's by far. If there's one thing that I've taken from using Octane recently, it's that V-Ray really needs to up their bump mapping quality, because Octane just rips everything apart. So I'm actually not liking how spread this right hand light is, and you can see it's actually spreading past the white part of the logo on the can. So I'm going to go into the light and just play with that. And just shorten it a little bit. And I'm going to do the same thing on the right hand side, the left hand side. So at this point, really the only thing left to work on before doing any bonus passes is just getting a little bit of light reflecting into the bottom of the can itself. You can see right now it doesn't look rounded because there's no sense of depth in that metallic base part. So to do that, all I've done is I've gone in and created a couple of Octane lights and just simply pointed them, and let me just kind of reconfigure the viewport here. Simply pointed them at the base of the can. So let me go to the orthographic view. And turn this light on. And you can see what it's doing is it's just bouncing that light into the top of the can here, which is reflecting into the floor and therefore also creating a little bit of lighting on the base. Now, I didn't want to go too powerful on this, because what starts to happen is you start to get a bit of light leaking. And if I want to enhance this base shape, I'm going to do it with a bonus pass anyway. So as you can see, because everything's realistic in Octane, the metallic paint at the base is just overblowing a bit. Same thing on the right hand side, except for this right hand side, I've just altered the size of the light to be a little bit smaller because I don't want an identical effect. So that's pretty much exactly how I've set things up. I'm going to turn these top three lights off and revert back to using the original lights so you can see that it's pretty much the exact same. You can see I've actually gone in and created one really soft light in the center here just to create a little bit more color, and then over the top of that I'm just bringing in that center light. And it's a fairly simple output in the end. I've only utilized 4 lights and a background image and a couple of lights and the background images in 3ds Max. So just to demonstrate Octane's bump mapping quality, I'm going to go in and change the can before I render off this final project and just show you how that works. So I'm just going to create a brand new material. It's just going to be a simple glossy material. With no diffuse. So you can see here we've just got a perfect kind of chrome material. If I apply that, now you can see the effect. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag out from the bump map and create a grayscale image, because the bump mapping requires less information. You don't need all the channels. And I'm just going to go in and load up the bump map I utilized in some of the V-Ray course lessons. Just a simple streaky noise texture that I've generated in Photoshop. So I'm just going to load this brush glossiness map. Actually, I'll use the hard one here. And now I've got to set the bump mapping to texture. And you can see what that's done is purely with bump mapping, I've created the anisotropic highlights. Now, if that texture is a little bit too big, you can actually go in and adjust the scale. So that's just adjusting the vertical scale. But I can also adjust the horizontal scale. And now you can see, no matter how crazy low res you go on the texture, Octane simply handles it perfectly fine. And the reason this is pinging off a little bit too much is because the bump effect is a bit strong. So I need to go down into the power here and reduce that, and now you can see we get that effect back. And to really demonstrate how awesome this is, I just need to go into the Octane settings and make the render a lot bigger, and I'll just region render for you how this comes out. So here's at 100%. And I'll just wait for that to clean up. Just get instant feedback. You can see the bump mapping effects probably a little bit too strong, and the scale of the maps not small enough. So I'm going to go into the transform and put this to 0.05. The only problem with this obviously is you get a bit of texture repetition. So to fix that, just use a larger map. And I'm also going to go down into the bump map power again and make that 0.05. I've never seen any render engine capable of creating bump mapping so clean and crisp like Octane. It's just ridiculous. Like, I really can't explain how crazy it is. But you'd never get that effect in V-Ray. I've actually tried to compare the two, and Octane just simply works in a different way to V-Ray. So that's all I've done for the lid here. It's just a similar material, just a simple grey with a bump map set to, tile and UV across. Obviously you need to rely on the UVs. But what it ends up doing is it creates a really nice, realistic effect. Now, another thing you can do to enhance the way metals look, I'm not sure if you guys realize, but every so often when you zoom in on metals, you kind of get this real sparkly effect, and you get some coloring in the pixelation that's it's not fully monochrome. You get a lot of variation which makes up that grey color. So to do that, you've got an option here by adjusting the film width. So if I go down and I just play with that, you can see I can create these tinting colors. So I'm going to undo the region rendering, go back to using a smaller render so we've got some faster real-time feedback. And I'm just going to play with the film width settings until I get something that's a little bit more chrome-like.